All right, so for the purposes of our recording, welcome everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm going to briefly go over our agenda. We are in the middle of our welcome. I'll warn everybody to get ready to turn on your camera because in a moment we are going to be sending you out into a breakout exercise. Serlene and I have spent a pretty good amount of time doing a lot of thought around some real case examples and vignettes that we have worked on is a way to show you, to illustrate how we've dealt with some really challenging situations. So we're going to go over 3 different case examples. There's going to be time for Q&A. We're going to really encourage you to use the chat to put in comments and Q&A in addition as we go. Part of the reason we're doing this breakout in just a moment is we're looking to customize some of what we share with you this morning based on the challenges and issues that you have. We're going to go over some more specific strategies for responding to challenging situations as we get to the top of the next hour. We're going to do another breakout so we can get more feedback from you just after 11. And then we're going to do more discussion and Q&A before we have to wrap up at 11:30. And we know it's going to go real quick. Next slide. So here is what we're looking to have happen in this morning's session. We want to support you in how to prepare for difficult situations you might be facing. We're hoping you will find the strategies that we are sharing for managing conflict in real time to be practical. We're going to be highlighting key skills that we have, are tried and true things that we have used for de-escalating situations and redirecting high emotion situations and in group situations. And we're going to support you in identifying how to build effective relationships, partnerships with an emphasis on empathy, active listening, building trust, and focusing on respectful relationships. Next. All righty. So here we are. You are going to have about 5 minutes where we want you to chat in pairs. When it comes to fears you have around difficult situations, concerns you have, high emotion situations, whatever it is, as far as individuals, small groups, large groups, like what brings you here to this session? And Jamie's going to send you out into pairs, and we will come back in 5-6 minutes to see what you have to share. Have fun. All right. So we want to welcome everybody back from your breakout. If you can open up your chat, it would really help Serlene and I if you'll share at least one thing that you talked about in your breakout. And then Serlene, if you want to invite a couple of people to talk verbally.
Sure. We'll do a virtual popcorn, right?
Exactly.
Does anybody put anything in the chat? Okay, here we go.
I could call in a few people.
Emotional
if you
triggers.
want.
But go ahead, go ahead, Sarah, call on a few folks.
Let's see, Eddie or Diana. Anyone willing to raise their hand and share? Alexander or Mary?
I can share, Sarah.
Great.
Hi, everybody. This is Andeep. I'm with Ocean Protection Council, and I actually see a lot of what I was going to say in the chat as well. So just to kind of echo what my peers are saying, I'm particularly interested in how to kind of like transfer a lot of that energy, especially when somebody's coming at you very hot and then bringing it to a very productive place, both making them feel validated that like they're being heard and listened to, but also like, you know, I guess building some of my own confidence, because I know for a fact that I tend to freeze. I tend to shut down in situations, especially if somebody's like very much in my face. And even if I'm consciously aware that they're angry at a policy, at something that's not me, it's hard to separate those emotions sometimes, especially when it's very like present and physical. So I would say half of it is like, building up my own emotional resilience and like, strength and confidence in dealing with that. And the other half is having like, tools or key phrases to essentially tell that person, I hear you, I see you, how do we move on from there?
Well said.
Yeah, you kind of answered your own statements. It was very well said.
We've got Marissa with her hand up. Go ahead, Marissa.
I can just talk kind of on behalf of some of the things that we mentioned in our group, but again, a lot of it was put in the chat. But we talked about not letting your emotions overcome you. And then also we've talked about the opposite of being able to be empathetic. And be able to listen to what they're saying to you and not come across as confrontational. And I think that this comes in internally with people that you work with, but also we are a state agency and we work very heavily with the public. So it also translates with maybe people that are very irritated with you being in their communities and why you're there and those strong emotions. So kind of we talked about all aspects of it.
Anyone else?
I'll just say I think it's the fear of being misunderstood. As a communicator, it's my goal to make sure that all parties, stakeholders understand each other. And so when there's rising emotions, that you run the risk of people misunderstanding what it is that they're each trying to say.
And I saw Steve had his hand up as well.
Yeah, just on behalf of the folks in my group, because I haven't heard it stated here yet, but we pretty much all of us, we ended up a group of people pleasers. And so our biggest concern is offending people, inadvertently offending people, or having people think poorly of us. Sometimes maybe avoiding raising a concern that may benefit ourselves and people with our same perspective, but avoiding bringing it up for fear of coming across as a troublemaker or something like that.
Steve, when you say that, do you have anything in mind that's internal organizationally versus external to the public or stakeholders, or both?
I can't speak for everybody in my group, but mostly thinking just interpersonally, and it can be either way. I mean, that's probably more internally in having conversations with folks and not wanting them to feel like you're a squeaky wheel or that you're insensitive, but it can definitely happen externally as well. It's like, I don't want to represent my department as being a jerk.
I see. That's helpful. I was sort of making an assumption that because that sounded like an internal one, but I didn't want to make any assumptions. All right. So last one, go ahead. Just Kamala.
Yeah, I was actually in Steve's group, and I think for me, it's more of the external. I never want to make anyone feel like they aren't being heard or they aren't being understood or their concerns aren't of any importance. And the other thing is coming across in a way that you're making someone feel like you don't want to be condescending, right? When you're communicating. And so I think finding that balance is challenging. And always, validating everyone's like emotions and fears and concerns.
Wonderful. Serlene, I think that's a great transition moment. The one thing I want to add on to that one is individually, we sure don't want to be condescending. I don't know if you guys want to do a reaction button, but I've been horrifiedly embarrassed when someone from my place I work is being condescending to someone and I'm witnessing it and I'm just like, oh my gosh, how am I going to help fix this? Jamie, you want to go to the next slide? Perfect. One more. All right. So we're about to dive in. We're just a little bit behind in our schedule. So I'm going to talk about this pretty quickly. We are, as I mentioned at the top, going to do a few case examples to help think through these challenges. And just so you know, for the sake of this training, we are thinking about situations from these three perspectives, but they all mush into each other. One is larger meetings, larger group meetings. You could have 25, 60, 150, and it's a challenging situation. Individual one-on-one or two-on-one kind of challenging situations. And then what we're terming segmented group dynamics. So for example, I might have one set of challenges when I'm working with labor, and I might have a different set of challenges when I'm working within the environmental justice advocacy or community group kind of segment of people involved in a given issue. Next slide. Okay, Sirlene.
My turn. Okay, so I want to, and I'm turning my head to look at some notes and some slides. You all know that. So first of all, I want to thank everybody because obviously everybody's got this level of awareness. So this is going to be more of a co-learning experience than a teaching experience because some of you stated your own problems and stated the approach to the problem. So we'll learn from each other. Also want to share that the examples that we're using today are old, and that's on purpose. We want to make sure that we're not associated with anything. And then Sarah also said she didn't want it necessarily related to anything that we are doing in our respective programs. So she didn't want it necessarily have anything to do with the communities we work with in DTSC, or likewise what you all are doing in the Department of Conservation. So this project, the Napa County Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process, is a project that Sarah and I worked on, and the case study went out for about 2 years. And RHNA, if you don't know, Regional Housing Needs Allocation Process is called RHNA. And if you don't know, RHNA is a process that governments, municipalities, and local governments do to determine the number, the actual physical number, 5, 15, 221, the number of housing units needed in low income, moderate income, and market rate housing in a community projected out 5 to 10 years, and it becomes part of the general plan. And back when we worked on the Napa case, there was no stick. So every city had to do this, or every jurisdiction had to do this, but there was no stick. There was no penalty if you didn't do it. So housing wasn't being built. In the last couple of years, that has changed. There's now a penalty or stick to it. And if you read the news last week, Portola Valley didn't have their plan certified because they didn't do what they were supposed to do in a certain period of time. So 10, 12 years ago, I really knew this stuff like the back of my hand. The last couple of years, some of the laws have changed, but we're taking this because, as I said, it's an old enough scenario, but it still has all the things that many of us work with. So it was Napa County. So that's Napa, Calistoga, even the small town, which is really a designated census place, called Angwin up in the hills in Napa County. We had the Napa County landed gentry, the elite, and we had farm workers. There was no real affordable housing to speak of in Napa. The farm working housing was really just not good. The city of Napa, so the city, had a major project coming in along the river that if you go up to Napa, you've probably seen some of that. And so we had the city versus the rural areas. We had to find places to have meetings and host the groups that we talked to. So we would go anywhere from Napa to Calistoga. And the people in Angwin would talk about how long it would take for them to come down to like St. Helena, would be like a 45-minute drive. So we couldn't have a more diverse group of people, even though on some, through a windshield survey, they didn't look that diverse. But for real, on a political, social survey, they were totally diverse. And so we would bring them together first by sectors. Oh, I guess I should go to the next slide. I'm sorry, Jamie.
That's okay.
We would bring them together first by sectors. Sarah and I did a whole design, a meeting process design, and we would meet with the housing people, the low-income housing people, the educators, the farm workers from there are the vineyards, the people who grow wine, grow grapes. There's associations and chambers of commerce and like that. And we would have these small group discussions with them to identify what the deal breakers were. And we would hold that information. Sarah and I would hold that information. These conversations were confidential. And then we would design having the community room or a meeting where we'd we'd explain what RHNA was. And at the time, as I said, I really knew this. So I was really good at explaining the process in terms that people could understand and explaining the formulas. And so we made sure we touched every stakeholder, every group that we could think of. And brought them in, and we did a little bit of shuttle diplomacy. Well, what if this happened, especially with the government officials? Like, we're hearing this, we're thinking this, what are you all thinking? And because of my experience in local politics, I also understood how ideas got interjected into the political conversation, into the boardroom. And literally, Sarah and I were going to boardrooms to report out. So what we provided is here, you can see the process design was really, really important. The stakeholder meetings, the conflict resolution and negotiation, bringing things back and forth to the decision makers. And what we found that worked really well for us was this collaborative approach. Also being informed. Again, having the subject matter expertise and information. And we were prepared for every situation. So we had this larger town hall meeting one day. Let's go to the next slide, Jamie. We had this larger town hall meeting one day. And we said, okay, you know, for lack of better terms, the guy who owns the large vineyard is going to come in, and he's not going to want housing up in northern Napa County. He's not going to want to do this. And lo and behold, he came in and he sat down, and you know, he started to get agitated. And it was really a moment where Sarah and I both read the room at the same time, and we could see that something was about to happen. And she was closer, but we both made a move toward him, to kind of, you know, how you tap somebody on the shoulder and say, we got you, we're going to let you speak, and that kind of thing. But we were able to give people the space they needed to air what their concerns were. We also did a strategy even before the meeting started, where we had breakouts. It's often employed when we do open house sessions and public meetings, where you have the breakouts of different stations so people can understand what's going to happen here or what this means there, and they can ask their questions without feeling embarrassed about asking their questions. So through all of that, what worked for us, at some level too, our own diversity worked for us. Sarah being white and my being Black, because of the dynamics of the county. Our own diversity really worked for us, as well as our active listening skills. And we talked about that a little bit in our breakout groups. Just, you know, being open and listening to people and leaning in, especially when we were doing the stakeholder analysis and the stakeholder meetings. And how to work with the technical staff, because there was a whole housing and planning staff and some others, to make the material accessible, understandable by the public. The other thing we did was making sure, as I said, I led this moment talking about the guy who came into the room that we kind of was a power broker. We all knew who he was. We designed the meetings so that he wasn't the star of the meeting. He was no bigger, no greater than anyone else. So everybody had the same, if you will, level playing field, the same amount of time, the same air time. And we did a lot of scenario planning. We sat back and said, what if this guy comes and what if this happens? And what if, we did a lot of what ifs. So that is kind of that scenario. Sarah, anything you want to add?
Well, I'll just thank you, Serlene. I'll just add another big piece of the project is that last bullet on the right side, which is the reassurance to the people in leadership positions as we were gearing up for these different meetings. They were very worried about all the different ways everything could go wrong. And I think that Serlene and I had the ability to reassure them that our design, because we'd done so much listening and information gathering, that we had a very solid design, and that if anything went wrong, we would be ready. And I think that in a lot of projects, reassuring your leadership or executive or whatever can feel like maybe 30% of a project. Because if you are not reassuring those people, it's very problematic. And I don't know if anyone wants to use the chat to share if that's a challenge for them too, reassuring people internally who are high up.
And we met with the director probably weekly, at least bi-weekly. I know it was frequent. I spent a lot of time going from the Bay Area up to Napa.
Yeah, totally. All right, well, let's go to the next one, and then we'll, unless anyone has any immediate question right now, kind of burning question of clarification. Otherwise, we'll keep going and then we'll do our discussion.
Okay.
All right, I don't see any immediate questions. Go ahead.
All right. So again, because Sarah and I have this 15-year relationship, she knows some of the things I do in the community outside of my professional consulting work or my work now with the state. And so one of the things we have in San Leandro is an organization called Unity in the Community. And again, the case study was presented by The Ohio State University. And it is about, it started because of some racist activities that were happening in San Leandro. One of the ground rules for Unity in the Community is that no one person can take credit for anything that has happened with Unity in the Community, because it was and is, all the efforts were a community effort. So it's not like Serlene's program. It's a group of people who make things happen, which actually help to the planning of the events. I just happened to be selected to be the co-vener and the facilitator every month for the last 8 years. I just got somebody in there to take it over last month. For the last 8 years, I've been there, so I got a lot of visibility, but there were a lot of people working at things, and so no one person takes credit. This picture actually is from a rally we did that I might talk about later, because what was unique about this was it was a march in response to hate crimes and police shootings that were, and sometimes still are, the theme of the day. But we planned it with the police, which was talk about an unusual collaboration that was. But what I am going to talk about, and we can go to the next slide, Jamie, is the meeting we had, the open big community meeting we had, which was in January 2018, which was called Free Speech or Hate Speech, Hiding Racism Behind the First Amendment. And as you know, the First Amendment is the freedom of speech. And hate speech is sometimes considered free speech, but it can also be just so devastating and damaging. And so a group of us planned a very open community meeting. It was an opportunity for us to educate anybody who wanted to be educated or informed or hear about this in our community, in our city. We held the event in the senior center. Probably about 200 people came. There were panelists, including the director of the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. There was the county DA's office represented, police, people who help navigate free speech and community activists. So there's great community interest. And while just having the title itself is positional and brings in polarizing viewpoints, people showed up with polarizing viewpoints. We had people show up with the Make America Great Again red caps on, and they were part of the audience next to others who are on the other side of that spectrum. So there was could have been a lot of tension in the room. One of the things with Unity in the Community, when we have our monthly meetings, and one of the things with this event that we had very strong and enforced ground rules. But the first ground rule was that conversations and topics about race are hard. They get to the core of who we are, and they can be emotional. So we have this whole ground rule of accepting that people are going to make mistakes in their language, accepting that we are going to pull back and try to pull through that. And so people who have been part of our workshops and our conversations in the past, they understood that. And they came into spaces respectfully. So when the Make America Great folks wanted to disrupt the conversation, when the attorney from ACLU was speaking, the audience self-policed. The audience told them to be quiet, members in the audience. And the man who was speaking at the time was like, well, that is free speech. So instead of shutting it down, it was kind of a way of acknowledging it, but controlling it. So that's how that worked for us. We had planned in the planning, and we kind of expected that they would come because, again, it was a community planned event by community people. So we were able to plan for many multiple scenarios. We scouted out the space. We did that for this. We did this. We recently did something on the topic of the day with Gaza and Palestine and Israel. And we scouted out the space, and we knew what we needed to do with the space. So these are our strategies. I don't want to read the list, but these were our strategies there. And we could go to the next slide. So again, the specific tactics that helped us be successful: active listening again, but process ownership, that we worked within the community. We worked with community members to plan this event. And because we worked with community members, when the Unity and the Community Core Group met, when the core group met, we were able to do our own analysis. And we stayed in the moment during the day, during the program. We didn't bring a lot of our other selves and other traumas and other stuff into the room. We stayed in the moment. And so we were able to create the safe space, monitor it, see where people were, read body language, all those things. So how to manage these high emotion, high stakes days? I put sleep at the top. Both Sarah and I, and maybe many of you, we stay up too late planning for all the scenarios. Someone in my breakout said, oh, I try to, I overthink. And so I say, turn that overthinking into a planning thought, like what if scenarios, but find the time to cut it off and get some sleep so that you can roll with the challenges of the program or the day. Be aware of your personal triggers, and a little later I'll talk about triggers, and be aware of the audience triggers. So there are some things that are going to trigger the audience that won't trigger you, and there's some things that are going to trigger you that you are going to have to control if you are monitoring and managing the process. And be prepared to hear that different voice or opinion. Acknowledge it. You don't have to embrace it. Just say, well, thank you for sharing, or that's there. Pace yourself. And again, in the group, we talked about, it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about what's happening in the moment, and focus forward on the goal. Like, getting through the program, making sure people understand what free speech is about, those kinds of things. So that's how I'm going to leave that, Sarah, everyone.
Wonderful. Any
so-
immediate burning questions? Oh, wait, we will have a next slide. Sorry, go ahead.
We have one more. Yeah, it's yours.
Yeah. Before we go into this individual example, any immediate kind of burning questions or comments from that one? All right. So here we're talking about either individuals where you're just working one-on-one, or maybe within a meeting when you have one really challenging individual. Next slide. And what we've done is we've kind of done a composite of some challenging people, because I feel very sensitive that I would never want someone to feel like I'm talking about them, because obviously no one would like that. So here's kind of what goes into our challenging person or people example. They're very persistent. They often challenge authority. They challenge the decisions the authority, in this case, generally the state, is making. They're very time consuming. They seem to have literally an unlimited amount of time on this. Communication can be so much communication. Communication can be really inconsistent. They could be very confrontational. And then the other one that has happened to us is where they're this kind of influencer or Pied Piper. So if you have a group setting and they talk first, other people kind of pile on, and your whole thing could potentially be going down a road that isn't really that useful, or it doesn't connect to the outcomes you're looking for. Any reactions to this? Anyone ever have anything like this happen to them? Next slide. Because if no one has these kinds of challenges, we could even just skip this.
We have those challenges. Please continue.
Okay. Okay, now I'm seeing in the chat with the exclamation points. Thank you, April. Don't skip this. Okay, thanks, Nick. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the skill set, which in a way you're going to see that Serlene and I are kind of sharing a similar list for skills in all these situations. I think of these skills as kind of your basic things on your tool belt, and then the tactics are how you're using the skills in the unique situations. So who is this person or people or group? You've got to do some research, and I'm just talking about like Googling a person. What do they look like on LinkedIn? Are there any articles with their names? Even the kind of person, if you see them in newspaper articles, that's a different kind of person who likes to be quoted and be in the newspaper as compared, and has a status that's different than someone who isn't that way. You got to get a basic understanding of the topic. There's usually people in your organization who could help you with that. Then there's the geographic nuances of where the area you're working in. And you really can't make assumptions about anywhere. Just because you did something in one county doesn't mean in this part of the county, the cultural vibe isn't unique. It generally is. Serlene has talked about active listening skills. That's kind of your key baseline for all this. And the emphasis on empathy and validation is paramount. And in the chat, we've seen the importance of empathy. The next thing is, this also connects back to, in a way, to the Napa example. I do a lot of plan A, not just A, B, and C. I'm like D and E. Trouble is setting aside plenty of time to do listening, and then empathetic statements, and summarizing and validating, because until the person feels heard, often emotionally they are not going to calm down. I have generally found in my career that like 95% of people will kind of peter out after 40 minutes. So with a new person, I kind of set a clock in my head of 40 minutes that I'm just going to be like, is there anything else I should know? That sounds hard. My gosh, you've been through a lot. All those kinds of empathetic statements. Being consistent, and oftentimes with these situations, there'll be some way that you're bumping into other agencies. For me, it often is like an air district, a city, or a county. And so I always try to be overly communicative, both so they know what's going on, but also oftentimes they'll have information that could be useful to you. Another big thing that, again, is not rocket science is you've got to follow through on your commitments that that you make to people. How many people on here have had an experience where someone is mad because they've had a past experience with your department or agency and people didn't follow through on their commitments? And so now you're having to deal with that. Right. So that's a real challenge. In in-person situations, I always like to kind of have a buddy system where those of us who are part of the staffing group, we kind of know that if anyone ends up kind of monopolizing us, after about 10 minutes, one of our colleagues will come up and stand next to us. And then I might introduce the person. I might just say, oh, I know so-and-so would want to hear more about what's going on with you. I might pretend I have to go to the bathroom as a way to switch out. But you also don't, especially if you're an in-person meeting, you don't want to get stuck for too long with someone because you have other things you need to do, but you also don't want them to not feel heard. You always have the option of suggesting you schedule individual meetings with folks. And the other thing we could get into more if you want is power dynamics. Depending, like Serlene talked about, the powerful like landowner person might make us be, with that kind of person, I'm always going to be using some kind of empathetic sentence that kind of implies they're so important to play to their ego as a tactic. So depending on who it is, you might want to adjust your tactics a little bit. Serlene, anything you want to add in?
No, I think we should keep it going.
Yeah, let's go.
Yeah.
Next one.
I think it's
All
good.
righty. Perfect. Yay, and we're back on time. Any quick questions or comments before we dive into some just points we want to make around conflict dynamics? Okay, thanks. Next slide. So we just want to remind you that conflict is normal, and that that's what our jobs are. They're dealing with these tough and complicated and often technical, challenging issues. So try to remember that when you're in these tough situations. I don't know if people want to use the little reaction button, a thumbs up or something like that, if you had a chance to take the conflict style self-assessment. Great. If anybody found it especially illuminating, if you want to raise your hand or come off mute to share what was useful about it. I know for me, the more I understand my own conflict style and I understand all the styles, it can help me think about and try to assess the style that other people I'm working with have or how they lead. Next slide. So to overly simplify, generally in most situations, depending on it, you've got people who are a little more on the engaging conflict direction or a little more on the avoiding conflict direction. And depending on where they're at, you have to adjust your strategies and tactics accordingly. Next slide. The other thing we want you to remember is as conflict escalates, it gets more difficult to manage. So if you're the one that's dealing with it, the sooner you're tackling the challenge or the conflict, it is likely to really be in your interest versus being like, I'm not sure how to deal with this, let me figure it out later. Next. Okay, Serlene.
Okay, so handling conflict. Breathe. There are a number of prescribed ways, if you will, for us to handle conflict. Almost like for my friends who are in communications, there's the communication spectrum, there's a spectrum for handling conflict. And so we start with the communication, actively listening. Why is there conflict? What is somebody trying to get across? What are they saying? What's truthful? What's not truthful? What are the assumptions? Sharing the information. You move forward, so you have negotiations. We both want the same thing. We want good salaries, but we have different ways of getting there. And so we have to negotiate that and make agreements. And then you have facilitation, mediation, and conciliation, which is really more about getting along. You know, negotiation is coming to the same point. Mediation and facilitation is about finding those places where you can get along. You know, mediation is used a lot in my world with landlord-tenant kind of work. So we don't have to arrive at the same thing, but we have to agree that I'm going to pay my rent on the 5th, and this is how much. And if I don't, then, you know, you have these points, and I'm not going to have 15 cats and all the things that you mediate on. And then there's the formal decision making, which just, you know, that's a hammer. It could be a hammer because it could be legal and it could be regulatory, but so that's going to niche whatever the conflict is, because you got to do it or there's a real tough penalty and you know what that penalty is. So those are the defined ways, if you will, or the spectrum of handling conflict, kind of just talking with your friend and coming up with an agreement to going to court or having the legislature tell you what you're going to do. So next slide, please. Sarah, do you want me to do this? Or you want to do this one?
Go ahead. You're on a roll.
So earlier in one of the slides in our example, we talked about like making sure the executive person or the, you know, the person who seems to have the most to lose is actually still able to be present in the community and not be embarrassed and keep prestige or what have you. And that's because a lot of times these conflicts happen because people feel threatened with their power or their public image or their representation. And that's more important to them than money, like what the cost of something is. That's where their worth is like, and who and how they present. And that also comes across not only in just like, okay, here I am presenting, but it comes across when you look at cultures and gender and power structures and occupation. So all of that is about our public image, and all of that comes into play. Sometimes you just have to let people be who they need to be, right? They have to, you might be bringing them on to agree with you, but they just have to keep their image true. They just have to be who they are. And next slide, please. And so in those cases, you have to create a safe space and allow a path for the individual to change their mind or position without embarrassment. You know, and so how do you do that? Some of that is, you know, meeting people where they are, not coming across as you're the one with the power because you're using fancy vocabulary and words, and you're dressed in your finest when you're working in the farm field, and all those things that can throw off the balance. So you want to anticipate people's behaviors. You want to identify and respect the differences. You want to be aware of your own approach, your own appearance. Looking at like the physical signs, the behavioral and emotional signs to create that safe space for them, whether it's a Zoom meeting, a boardroom meeting, or you're literally out in a field somewhere. Because sometimes, you know, I had a conversation recently with a stakeholder and something was not true. It is not true. Something is not true. And we have copious sheets of paper to show that it's not true. And the position back was, but you have to allow me the space to believe that it is true. And I do. And then I have to look at that as if to say, okay, well, if that person believes it's true, what can I interject into this conversation that's not like hitting him over the head to show that it's not true, so that he can change his mind and not be embarrassed and not lose prestige and status in the community that he represents. Okay, next slide. Oh, this is me too. Okay, I'm on a roll here, everybody. Strategies for
And I
responding.
can chime in if you want. You're
Oh,
doing
please,
great.
Sarah, anytime.
I will. But we're doing good. And then we're going to go to our breakout.
Okay, so strategies for responding, and we've talked about active listening over and over again. Can we go to the next slide, please, Jamie? And active listening, we are, I can tell you what it's not for sure, because I know we all do this. We all have these Zoom meetings or Teams meetings, and we're working on a document on one screen and half listening on the other screen. The conversation is the radio and the background noise. That's not active listening. Active listening is leaning in, it's parroting back or saying but meaning, not as an exercise, but because you're engaged in the community, in the communications. Reading the tone, listening for the tone, reading the person's emotions, that's active listening. And that helps you know how to guide the conversation, especially if you're trying to manage the conflict. So also pay attention to symbols, metaphors, and stories. Like if something is in your world, in your friendship circle, if something is a common phrase, it may not be the common phrase you need to introduce to the larger organization. Symbols, metaphors, and stories, they mean a lot of things to different people. We talked in the breakout about empathy. Empathy it unites people. I understand. Tell me how that felt for you. What was that like for you? Acknowledge the differences. I haven't had that happen before. Again, with the empathy, how can I help? How can I be of support? So communication skills, next slide. And this, as the kids say, this part right here, the high emotions of speaking and listening. So if we have the active listening and things are triggering you, you have your own triggers, this is when you have to know what triggers you. And you should go into that meeting knowing that you will do what you can to manage that. And half of that is being aware ahead of time. One of my triggers, for real, and I'm going to say this in front of the people I work with, but it's probably why I do the work I do. One of my triggers is exclusion. So if I feel like if I'm having a meeting with all of you right now, or 4 of you right now, and one of you says, well, I'll tell the rest of you about it later offline, I am going to immediately feel excluded. And it might be because it had nothing to do with what we're talking about right now, but I am going to think that this is my trigger. I'm going to think that you didn't want to tell me that thing. And so I've often been in those situations and I have to breathe through it and say, it's not about me. It was another topic, it's offline. It was going to take 10 minutes longer than we had for that meeting, that kind of thing. So understand yourself, what it does for you. I also have a strength, and my strength is that when I'm in tense situations, I actually sweat in the small of my back and not across my forehead or any place else, so I can maintain cool at all times. But other people don't have that strength, so you have to be able to do what you can do to maintain yourself, maintain your calm. You can always step away from something and step back into it. So again, I don't want to read through all of these. You guys can read this. Ground rules are another good way, especially in this virtual world. Ground rules are another good way of controlling high emotion meetings. When you say in the ground rule, we're going to have, one person speak at a time. If you monopolize the conversation, if there are outbursts, you will be dismissed from this meeting. I once had a meeting where that was the ground rule, and the gentleman in the meeting was very boisterous and kind of bully. It's virtual, so he's just, you don't represent the community, you don't know our community, and who are you here for, and yada yada yada. But his presence, his tone, actually made my client, a very grown woman, revert back to abusive childhood tones, and she shut down. And okay, I didn't know why she shut down. I just thought she was mad too. But it wasn't until after the meeting that I understood, when she explained to me what happened, that she was actually traumatized by that. So know your triggers, know when to remove yourself from the situation. And her silence was her way of removing herself from the situation. Okay, next. Disagreeing respectfully. I gave that example of the person who says, well, I have to give him the right to not believe that what I think is true is true. So that's a disagreeing respectfully. We agree to disagree. Also, you could also ask how they came to that conclusion or that point. And you can share your reason. And again, basically it's disagreeing respectfully and agreeing to disagree, and also leaving that opportunity for neither one of you to be embarrassed, actually, but for that person not to be embarrassed, especially if you are the person who seems to have the power seat or the authority. And most of us in our positions in these government seats have the authority. We're going to the community, we're going to programs because we have something that they want. There's a power dynamic there. So you have to give people an out. Next slide. Sarah, this is you. I guess I've said a lot in those previous 4 or 5 slides. So to parrot Sarah, are there any burning questions or statements? The chat is filling up. I can't read the chat while I'm talking. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I've been
anything?
responding to some of the ideas. Next slide, Jamie. This again, we're really not bringing up any kind of nuclear science level ideas here. We're just reminding you that with these challenging situations, you have to prepare. And the way that I prepare is I always try to look at these 3 scenarios. What is my ideal outcome, or the ideal thing I'm hoping how it's going to go? What is kind of the status quo if say kind of a regular whoever always worked here did stuff, how would it go? And then what's my worst case? And then that helps me plan. And then I'm writing out scenarios and outline. I'm rehearsing them with other people. If I'm going to speak, I'm going to be nervous. I might, I often on my own phone video myself alone doing my opening sentence or 2, because usually I'm the most nervous at the beginning, and then I kind of calm down once the meeting starts. So I really want my first sentence or 2 to be really strong. So we're suggesting you do some planning and practicing. Next slide. All right. So we're going to send you into breakouts. You're going to be in groups of 4. And and you could start jotting it down right now too. We want you to be thinking about your big takeaways. What is resonating with you that we've shared so far? Welcome back. Welcome back, welcome back. All right, we have 6 minutes left. So I'm going to have us do 2 things. Serlene and I are going to have you do 2 things at once. Jamie, do you mind going to the next slide? One more. All righty. So here are your 3 assignments because you're all big thinkers at the same time. In the chat, can you share at least one big takeaway that you have? Just something you got validated around something you're already doing, or you didn't think about X or Y. So in the chat, one thing that's a big takeaway. And then the other thing is, we would like you to spend a moment and, you know, set a goal or 2 for yourself. Is there anything that you might do this month, the month of April? Like read an article or research something, talk with someone who was interesting that was also in the meeting today. And then is there any kind of larger goal you might set for yourself? Maybe something you would do before the end of the summer, for example. So think about some goals. And while you're doing that, we want to see if anyone wants to ask any questions that Serlene and I could try to real time help folks out. So let's say we've got 2 people with hands. Let's see if we can get to both Cynthia and April. Cynthia, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Someone in the chat mentioned that they were gonna watch some videos about people managing difficult meetings online. I was wondering if you all had some additional resources or suggestions for us to listen and read more about this sort of stuff.
I don't as far as videos. I only deal with like written stuff. What about you, Serlene?
I don't have any videos. I'm sure you could Google and find some. I have some books that I've used over the years to help with, and we can put them in the mailing that goes out afterwards. They're about negotiation or conflict and critical conversations. That I'll be glad to share.
April?
I don't so much have a question as I do a comment. I don't deal with I've told several people, I don't deal with large groups of people very often, like a lot of you folks here do. I wish that I did, because I love the conflict. I love dealing with it. I'm crazy. I love it. But I've heard one day I probably will deal with large groups like this. And I love the conversation that's been happening and seeing like the different situations that everyone's been put in and how you guys are handling it. My situations are more of a one-on-one. But I think one of the key things I think is really important is empathy, relating to people and seeing where they're at and trying to put yourself in their position the best that you can. Doesn't always work. And then like people, like somebody said, one of you might have just said this, people just want to be heard. 9 times out of 10, just listen to them, let them go on and on and on. And I don't know, that's my experience, is they've just been, they're happier after that. Like, oh, somebody answered the phone. Because a lot of times, it's like nobody even answered the phone. So I just appreciate this conversation overall. And I want to thank everybody for being a part of it.
Thank you so much, April. I just had a couple weeks ago a similar thing where about an hour and 15 minutes into a conversation, this man kind of held the phone away for a second. He's like telling his wife, honey, someone's listening to me. So cute. All right, it's 11:29. Any last closing thoughts, Serlene? I'm so grateful we could do this together.
Yeah, and I was going to say thank you for including me, Sarah, Jamie, and by extension, on behalf of my unit and department, thank you for bringing in DTSC into this space. It was fun. We haven't done anything like this, well, since the pandemic, actually. I think the last time we did something was in Oakland, when we were all at the endowment, at the foundation, doing a little plan. It wasn't a big group, but it was a planning session. So
I love going to I love that building. I wish we could go do an in-person thing there. Thanks, everybody.